Thank you very much. I wanted to tell you that Stephen's presentation and my presentation and Bob's presentation following, I'm not sure if it could have come together if we had planned it better than it will. So my name is Brad Taylor. I'm the Vice President of Data and IoT Solutions at Omnitrax. And talk a little bit about Omnitrax and how it ties back into the trucking market, because you'll see how beautifully this will flow. And I'm going to talk about the data that we're pulling from our cloud and then the fog around the truck, and how we're using that to predict the future of fleet. So having a historical perspective is very helpful when you're trying to actually look at things and predict the future. And so Omnitrax was Qualcomm's original business. And Jacobs and Viterbi started by basically using their satellite protocols to connect trucks to their back offices. So that gives us a very long history of starting with relatively simple connectivity, but continuing to adapt to the changes that have happened with the growth of the Internet of Things. It's not uncommon when I talk to people that they think of the most intelligent vehicle around is the Tesla. And if you look at the Tesla, it's just gone over 100,000 units sold. If you think about it, even now, just counting Omnitrax trucks with no other automation, there's over 500,000 trucks on the road from Omnitrax that have some level of automation on them right now. And so one of the things that I think is not realized, because the average person doesn't think about the sophistication of the connected truck, is that data and diesel really moved the supply chain. Recently, there was a sort of analysis done of what would happen if the internet went out, if we lost some of that connectivity. And for an example, Amazon, who heavily uses fleets, would, basically does almost 2 million in deliveries a day, and potentially could lose $250,000 in a single day from an operating shutdown. The trucks would still move, but they wouldn't move as efficiently. And so because of the economic impact of the fleet and the fact that it's so tied into movement and routing and talking to government regulation and infrastructure, we actually get a lot of data, as well as being a relatively significant player in the Internet of Things. And so coming into our SaaS cloud, we're pulling this data off the fog of the truck, because we're providing a gateway technology for all the OEMs. To give you an idea, it's a little bit different from the car market. Adaptive cruise control, lane keeping are all third-party OEMs that companies like Peterbilt will include at their customer order specification. And then they will use a product like our Omnitrax IVG to provide the digital gateway, and we will capture either through a Bluetooth connection, a physical connection, information off the COM bus, or something else. We will capture all this information and ship it back, not only for the fleet's use, but also for the use of the OEMs themselves. And so this is an important part of the orchestration, and then you tie that in with the routing and the ordering and a number of the elements we do. It gives us hundreds of billions of data points just on the location and the movement of the trucks. And so we get a lot of really interesting insights, and we've used those both historically for sort of the traditional reporting, but we've actually, almost 10 years ago, started moving into analytics and then more heavily into predictive analytics in more recent times. So the average truck will begin to collect on the order of terabytes per year. We obviously are not going to bring all of that back. It's a longer discussion on what kind of actions you begin to take on a vehicle where you need more of a high real-time intervention and safety level, as Stephen has discussed. But we will come back and pull a lot of that information back and try to use that in productive ways, both for the fleets themselves and for our own purposes, to try to determine what products are going to be effective, both from a safety and a market perspective. So our IoT data really drives a lot of what's happening in fleet right now. We plan deliveries and routing. The weather changes that can drive a navigation modification that were mentioned by Stephen, those are some of the things that we do right now. Part of our offerings as a company in my group, which includes Predictive Analytics, we use the data either from regulatory data sets, from company data sets, or from the data we capture to provide data sources for predictive analytics. And the advantage of doing this is because a lot of times with regulatory data sets, because there's an enforcement process with it, the data is very clean, and you have fewer problems than you would say would bring in multiple data sets and then trying to compare them and use the same taxonomy, which sometimes in a predictive model will cause overfitting problems. And the outcome of that is we remediate a lot of potentially negative events for the fleets. As an example, we model over 50,000 drivers a month for both retention and safety purposes. How many people have a device in their car that they ever use? There's some safety devices now for the consumer where they allow you to video your driving. Anybody here using anything like that? So video has become a very important part of the overall offering within fleets because if there's an accident, it's an order of magnitude difference in the fleet payout, depending if it's the truck's fault or it's the other driver's fault. And so even the simplest video can be used in remediation purposes. But obviously you have to have corresponding metadata with that. There's some level of identification that you have to do. At scale, that will be hundreds and hundreds of terabytes. Right now it's being very selective in what we bring back, but it's a complementary point of information to a traditional model of looking at safety and operational usage that had been in the fleet industry for years. And the great thing is because we're getting video data from not only our products, but from partner products, we're getting tilt-over information from linear accelerometers that might be provided by OEMs. All of this is flowing through our gateway, through the fog and then into the cloud. And so it helps the fleets, but it gives us a really good perspective on what's happening and allows us to build a shared model with our OEM customers. So one of the things that's very clear with all this going on is that the data usage will only continue to grow, and we'll have to make more and more decisions about what data we use in the truck, what we bring back to the back office. And it's a growth problem that's very significant. And when we came in and looked at this originally, my team, and I joined Omnitrax not quite 2 years ago, the intent there was try to assess some of the assumptions that had been in place for a long time. The fleet industry has not evolved terribly quickly compared to, say, automotive in the last few years. But it was changing. There was more investment going into safety to advance safety systems. And we went in and took a look at that in detail to try to get some new perspectives on what was happening. The unstructured video-like data, besides the growth it provides, also provides some challenges. We'd like to use it in more interesting and innovative ways. One of the things we're talking about potentially is maybe a traffic product at some point where if we see a slowdown in the vehicle, because we're obviously tracking what the truck does, we might recognize something that's a car at the side of the road. We might be able to use that as a notification to other drivers that there's an issue. So we think video has some interesting possibilities. With the ADAS systems, the following distance, that Stephen somewhat talked about, and then lane keeping, if you think about how you drive every day, and I have a car that has both adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, there are millions and millions of events happening as following distance changes, as lanes change. And for a fleet, if you're trying to monitor the safety of a driver, we went back and looked at sort of the data patterns that traditionally we used to identify safety in predictive analytics, and it was mostly around predictive braking, whether you were doing an overspeed or not in a particular time zone, and some other manually related events we were getting off the bus of the vehicle. When we went back and actually analyzed the data we were getting, now that ADAS systems were coming out, 15% of our fleets were generating 90% of the data. The traditional markers like braking events and speeding had fallen to less than 9% of the data. And that was, again, only with ADAS systems with a 15% penetration of the fleets. So we know that with some of the mandates coming down, that there will be a pretty significant growth in that data. Because if it's already generating 90% of our events, by the time it's regulatorily required for 100% of the trucks, that's going to be a significant increase in volume. Finally, the most interesting things when you're in a regulated industry is the regulators can be both your best friend, and also they can kind of require you to make significant investments to adapt to changes. So the fleet industry right now for the long haul is dealing with something they call the ELD mandate, the electronic log mandate. And so we're having to go back and change the hours of service requirements and begin to look at how that's going to impact us, what the implementation changes are going to be, and what those implications are. The good news for us is that the regulatory standards are getting smarter in the sense as they've gone from relatively simple stipulations about what hours of service would be, but they now have technical implications, and they drive more connectivity, and more data. So what do we understand about the future having looked at this? So I've just, in the sort of kind of the late night show theory, I'm going to go through a top 5 of what you're going to see in the future of fleet. So unfiltered data is the next 2 big thing. If you have a dramatic expansion of events and the associated capture of that and perhaps transmission of that, it will be very difficult without the appropriate tools in place to actually go from something that's just a data point to something that's a relevant implication. And so we're starting to think about that growth in data right now, especially around ADAS systems. So the second thing is, Hawthorne will be looking on your behavior. How many of you are familiar with the Hawthorne effect? So the Hawthorne effect is, if you're under observation, does your behavior change? And does it stay changed, even after some period of time where you begin to ignore it, or do you begin to ignore it? So we find Hawthorne effect to be a very important thing to analyze. It has implications around safety. How many notification events can you give into the fleet cab before it becomes a detriment rather than an additive? We also want, right. And so, you know, if you're in your Tesla and you're watching a movie, maybe that's not a good thing, right? But that's a behavior you probably want to avoid. So with video monitoring how the driver's behaving, with driver coaching, which are some of the things that we do with our predictive analytics, these are all things that not only have implications for what we ought to be doing as a company or as a society, but they help us make decisions on what we ought to continue to do with our efforts in the big data area and then the safety we get out of that. And again, perfect segue off Stephen, trucks will be dating. We're in the process of becoming the Tinder for trucks. We already track 100 billion location points, over 100 billion location points a year for trucks. And so my group was responsible for going back and doing the analysis of platooning, where we went and worked with a very large fleet to do an analysis of what the implications of truck platooning would be from an ROI perspective. And what we found is that the ROI, depending on the price point of the equipment, is relatively long-term if you only do intra-fleet platooning, even in a very large fleet. But if you do inter-fleet platooning, you can dramatically reduce the time to get your ROI as an individual fleet as the critical mass grows of trucks. And so we actually have announced a partnership with Peloton and the high-speed architecture we've put together to basically analyze these location points tied back to our routing capabilities and OmniTracks are going to help make truck dating a reality. So this is born of hard personal experience. Your data is worth something, and in data monetization, legal is the new black. I've spent as much time with the lawyers as I have working on our high-speed architecture. Big data with what we're doing is like real time, and the ownership of the data or the sharing rights of the data becomes very important. We're negotiating that every day, not only with commercial parties, but even with research institutes like Atri, who are very interested in looking at the patterns and truck flows that exist in the marketplace. And then finally, out of personal experience, I wish IoT did not require so much communication. Before I was out OmniTracks, I was at Jasper Technology, so I've dealt with a large number of flavors of IoT communication. Obviously, I'm very excited about that we'll have some of the low-powered wideband. And we use Bluetooth and a number of other communication mechanisms, including Wi-Fi, CDMA, satellite, GSM, LTE. So you can imagine it's an interesting challenge that fortunately I only have to provide them with the data on. But I don't expect this problem to get any more simplistic. I only expect it to expand, and we're hoping that some of the things we're doing in the big data area around the analysis and the filtering will help us with the management of our 500,000+ assets on the road every day. So thank you very much. I think you'll find, what we've done, what Stephen has talked about, a great intro to the next thing that Bob is going to talk about.
Thank you, Barry. Are there any questions?
Any questions, real quick?